それでは皆さん, today I would like to introduce one more new form that we will use in Japanese in this class. So the form that I want to talk about is one so we will start talking about it here in this last chapter of Japanese 1010, and then we'll use it all the time in the future coming up. So it'll be really important. So we're just going to kind of get started this semester, and as you practice it more and more in the coming semesters, you'll get more and more solid on how to use it. So what we're practicing is called the te form. And the te form is a little bit special. We don't really have something like this in English. Te form is not actually a tense. It's a form that we use for making connections in Japanese. So we use it to connect, for example, two verbs or two adjectives. We're not actually going to do adjective te form this semester. We'll talk about it a lot next semester. So for this semester, we're just going to focus on using it to connect verbs. And there's a whole bunch of different ways that we can use this te form to connect verbs in Japanese. For example, we can use it to make requests. So back at the beginning of the semester, your sensei or your lab sensei probably practiced with you like, mite kudasai, kiite kudasai, kaite kudasai. And we tell someone to like, please look, please listen, please write. That is using this form. We also use it when we're asking permission to do something. We use a te form plus mo ii desu ka? So te mo ii desu ka, like may I do this? And we also have te wa ikemasen, which means like you may not do this or that. The other way that we can use te form, and this is one that'll be really useful to us, is that we can use it to join some sentences together. So before, we did learn a word for and. We learned like the particle to, but we can only use that to join nouns, right? So once we learn the te form, we can use it to join whole sentences. So if you wanted to say, I studied and then I went to sleep, using this te form, we can put those together in one sentence. So how exactly do we make the te form? So let's take a step back and remember the three types of verbs that we talked about in the previous lesson. So we have do verbs, u verbs, and irregular verbs are our three types of verbs. So we are going to have to take a look at the dictionary form. So that's the form that we find written in your textbook on the vocab list or in the dictionary. And we are going to use the dictionary form to determine if it's a do verb, an u verb, or an irregular verb. So like we talked about before, do verbs are verbs where we replace something at the end of the verb. And these are all of these verbs will end in do. We also have u verbs. These are verbs where when we do something to them, we have to change the sound at the end. And these verbs can end in u, tsu, do, bu, mu, nu, ku, gu, or su. I know that we'd said do verbs were a category. Some of our u verbs can end in do. So once again, those are the ones that end in, for example, adu, odu, udu. And we have a couple, like kaeru, that are u verbs even though they end in an iru or eru sound. But for the most part, if it ends in iru or eru, it's a do verb. If it ends in oru, uru, aru, it's an u verb. And obviously, if it ends in anything that's not do, it's an u verb. You can review the previous online participation activity if you want to go over how to distinguish between u verbs and do verbs. We also have irregular verbs. There's only two of them, kuru and suru. So kuru meaning to come, it's the dictionary form of kimasu, and suru meaning to do. It's the dictionary form of shimasu. Any other irregular verbs that we're going to run into in Japanese are just variations on these two. So once again, do verbs with an e sound or an e sound before do, u verbs, they either have an a, u, o sound before do, or they have any one of these other syllables. And irregular verbs are just kuru and suru. So when we want to put verbs in the te form, what we're going to do is we're going to take the do at the end. We're going to take whatever syllable is at the end, and we're going to change it to something else. Usually something that has to do with the syllable te. So we have, for example, our do verbs. These are the easiest ones. For do verbs, all we have to do is get rid of the do and change it to te. So for example, taberu will change to tabete. Miru, so we're going to get rid of the ru, and we just have mi left over, and then we're going to put a te. So miru changes to mite. Okiru, we get rid of the ru, and what's left is oki. Then we're going to add the te, okite. Neru, we get rid of the ru, and we just have ne. So nete. So taberu, tabete. Miru, mite. Okiru, okite. Neru, nete. So if it ends in a do verb, it's always just going to be te. If it's a do verb, the ending will always just be a te. If it's an u verb, the te form ending will never just be te. It's always something else together. So we'll talk about the u verbs in a minute. First, let's look at the irregular verbs. These are pretty easy. They don't really follow a fixed pattern. You just have to memorize them, but they're not that hard to memorize because there's only two. So kuru will change to kite and suru to shite. So kuru, kite, suru, shite. Our last set of verbs, these are the ones that are a little bit tricky in the te form. So these are our u verbs. So here's what we do with u verbs. If it's a verb that ends in u, tsu, or do, so for example, au, the short form of aimasu, or matsu, the short form of machimasu, or kaeru, the short form of kaerimasu, then we are going to get rid of that last syllable and change it to a small tsu plus te. So aimasu, au, the te form is atte. Machimasu, matsu, the te form is matte. Kaerimasu, kaeru, the short form is kaete. If the verb ends in mu, bu, or nu, we are going to get rid of that last syllable and change it to nde. So for example, nomimasu, the short form is nomu. So nomu, we will get rid of the mu and put nde. We get nonde. So nomu, nonde. For bu, we only have one bu so far. It's one of our new verbs from this chapter. Asobu. Asobu will change to asonde. And verbs that end with nu, we actually only have one verb that ends with nu in the whole Japanese language. Shinu, which is one of our new words from this chapter. Shinu, we're going to get rid of the nu, change to nde. We get shinde. So we're going to do the same kind of thing with verbs that end in su. Instead of getting, what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of the su, and instead of these other ones that we talked about, we're going to change it to shite. So for example, hanashimasu, the dictionary form is hanasu. So we are going to replace the su with shite, and we get hanashite. For verbs like kaku that end in ku, we're going to get rid of the ku and change to ite. So kaku, kaite. For verbs that end in gu, we are going to change the gu to ide. So for example, oyogu, oyoide is what we get. So there's one special exception in Tform. Instead of changing to ite, iku changes to ite. So we just have this one verb that's a little weird. Iku will change to ite. So that kind of seems like a lot to memorize. I know that it does. And this is something we will practice more and more over time. But there's also a really helpful way to remember this Tform pattern for verbs. We call it the Tform song. To spare my neighbor's ears a little bit, well, I'll give it a shot so that you guys can see it here along with the chart. So the Tform song, there's a couple of different versions, and if you look up Tform song on YouTube, you'll probably find a couple of versions. This is the one that we use at UNT. Utsuru te, mubunun te, sushite, kuite, guide, surushite, kurukite, iku, ite. Okay, I won't repeat it because I want to spare my neighbor's ears a little bit. But this is the Tform song that we have at UNT. So we have also here a little video that I've attached that you can use to listen to it. So this is the Tform song.
One, two, three, 移ってムブムンでそしてくいてぐいでくるきてするしていくいて1、2、3、4
So that's the Tform song. So practicing that, I know that it seems silly, but practicing that can make it a lot easier for the Tform to stick in your head, to get used to this pattern, which is a very useful thing to do because this is something that we will be using all the time for the rest of the time that we are studying Japanese. So let's practice a little bit. You can pause the video if you want. See if you can change these verbs that we have here to the Tform. Ready? Okay, let's see if we can check them together. So, the Tform would be あって、聞く、聞いて、行く、行って、話す、話して、待つ、待って、死ぬ、死んで、飲む、飲んで、帰る、帰って、泳ぐ、泳いで、遊ぶ、遊んで。Good job! So let's see if you can use this information to practice some of the Tform activities below.